You stayed. Good. This isn't a full lesson tonight. More like an extra chapter. Something that you only find if you linger in the library after the lamps have dimmed. You already know about the Baobhan Sith, the dancing women, the silk dresses, the blood, and the heather. But there are things that the old stories hint at, but never quite explain. So tonight, let's open that page. In modern retellings, the Baobhan Sith are called vampires. But in older Scottish folklore, that word didn't really exist. They weren't undead in the way that we imagine now. They were predatory fae, bound to the land, the forest, and the hunt. Older texts sometimes call them spirits, but in Scottish folklore, they belong firmly to the fae. They didn't rise from coffins, they didn't haunt crypts. They waited, and they chose carefully. Men who were already alone, already travelling at dusk, and already tired enough to follow music into the trees. That wasn't coincidence, that was selection. When later writers began translating these stories, they reached for the nearest word that they had: vampire. But that label flattens something far older, because the Baobhan Sith were never about the dead returning. They were about the other. The beings that existed alongside humans, sharing the same land, but not the same rules. They didn't come from graves. They came from forests, from glens, from places where humans passed through, but never truly belonged. They weren't monsters hiding in darkness. They weren't creatures in the land. They were the land, given intention. Those green dresses in the stories aren't just for aesthetics. In older folklore, green isn't pretty woodland fairy green, it's warning green. Green is the hill, the mound, the place that you don't build on, the colour of things that aren't meant to be human. So when the Baobhan Sith arrives, dressed in green, the story is quietly telling you that you're not dealing with a woman from the village. You're dealing with the landscape, wearing a face. One detail turns up again and again in these stories: the dance. The Baobhan Sith didn't attack immediately. They danced, spinning, laughing, encouraging their victims to join them. Because dancing did something important. It tired the body, it raised the pulse, it dulled judgment. By the time the blood was taken, the victim was already weakened. Some versions even say that the women never stopped dancing, even after feeding, as if the movement itself was part of the hunger. Now, music plays a strange role in Scottish folklore. It draws, it distracts, it blurs judgment. The fiddle especially was often treated with suspicion, not because it was evil, but because it invited people to linger, to stay out too long, and to forget where they were. The Baobhan Sith didn't chase their victims, they kept them there. The dance wasn't just exhaustion, it was consent manufactured through glamour. By the time the danger revealed itself, the choice had already been made. It's not an accident that so many versions place this in a bothy. A bothy is meant to be shelter, fire, walls, safety. But folklore loves a place that's almost safe, because it creates the worst kind of mistake, the moment that you relax. You're not deep in the forest anymore, so your guard drops, and then something knocks at the door. Not bursting in, not attacking, knocking, because that's the point. You let it in. You already know iron protected against them, but not because it killed them. Iron was grounding, cold, heavy, human. The Baobhan Sith were creatures of glamour, movement, beauty, illusion. Iron disrupted that. In some tales, the women didn't scream or burn when iron was shown. They simply recoiled, as if reality had suddenly snapped back into place. In fairy lore, iron doesn't wound in the way that weapons do. It interrupts. It anchors things back to the human world. That's why iron horseshoes were nailed above doors, why iron nails were hidden in clothing, and why travellers carried iron pins. Iron reminded the Fae they weren't in control of this space. And when glamour breaks, what's left isn't always violent. Sometimes it's simply revealed. Iron isn't just metal, it's human hands, human fire, human industry. In folklore terms, it's civilization, which is why it breaks glamour. Because glamour thrives where human rules are thin, in wild places, old places, places with no witness and no law. Iron is law, not moral law, not justice, just the blunt reality of this world belongs to humans too. And that's why the Fae recoil, not because it wounds them, but because it reminds them that they don't own the whole map. This is the part most modern versions leave out. The Baobhan Sith were intelligent. They spoke. They negotiated. They tricked. Some stories describe them arguing among themselves over prey. Others hint that they remembered men who escaped and waited for them years later. They weren't animals. They were neighbours, the dangerous kind that the Fae are known for. This is one of the most unsettling details. The Baobhan Sith did remember. They recognised patterns. They noticed habits. They learned routes. Some versions of the stories imply that they weren't hunting randomly. They were managing territory. The men who escaped weren't lucky. They weren't forgotten. In Fae folklore, being remembered isn't comfort. It's a warning. The victims in these stories aren't random. They're almost always men, travelling alone, at dusk or night, and already away from home. That matters. Folklore doesn't choose details casually. The Baobhan Sith appear where social rules thin, where witnesses disappear, where protection fades. They weren't hunting strength, they were hunting absence. By the late 19th century, stories of the Baobhan Sith begin to thin. Not because people stopped believing, but because the landscape changed. Forests were cleared. Travel changed. Men no longer wandered alone with fiddles and no weapons. The creature didn't vanish, the conditions did. And folklore always follows behaviour. When folklore fades, it just means that the behaviour changed. Gas lamps, inns, safer roads, less wandering. These stories didn't need retelling because the warning had already been learned. Creatures don't vanish, relevance does. The Baobhan Sith weren't cautionary tales about women. They were warnings about liminality, about wandering too far from safety, about mistaking beauty for kindness, and about assuming the world beyond the firelight played by human rules. They warned people to travel together, to carry protection, and to listen when the land felt wrong. And that's the extra chapter. Not a monster story, a warning. About isolation, about glamour, about following music when you should be finding shelter. Try not to think about it. I'll leave the lamp on. Good night.